Thank you all for coming. Thank you, everybody. It's so nice to be in a room full of people that I say, tell me about Paul Rudolph, and I'm sure you guys would probably tell me something that I don't know. So thank you all for coming and being it's nice to be around so many people who are interested in Paul Rudolph's life and work. Good evening, and thank you for joining us for the event, Paul Rudolph, A Way of Working. My name is Kelvin Dickinson, and I am president of the Paul Rudolph Heritage Foundation. And I would like to thank the Center for Architecture, the team who put both the exhibition here and at the Modulator building together, and the speakers tonight for making this event possible. And first, I'd like to take a moment to talk about the Paul Rudolph Heritage Foundation. The foundation is committed to preserving Mr. Rudolph's legacy and inspiring the public through an understanding of his ideas about architecture and design. We do this through preservation efforts, educational initiatives, public events like this, and maintaining and developing an archive of written and graphic materials which we maintain available to the public. As a 501c3 nonprofit organization, we depend on the public to help us preserve Paul Rudolph's legacy so that it can continue to inspire future generations. Please consider a tax-deductible donation or volunteering if you want, or now you can even purchase a copy of a Paul Rudolph designed chair that he designed for himself, which is on display in the room next to us. Our headquarters are in the Paul Rudolph Design Modulator building, named after the lighting company that he and Ernst Wagner co-founded. I'd like to welcome you to come see our sister exhibition entitled Paul Rudolph, The Personal Laboratory, which is on display there until December 30th. It focuses on Mr. Rudolph's exploration of space and materials in his personal homes, both at Beekman Place and New Haven, as well as the Modulator building, and includes personal memorabilia celebrating his life and his endless curiosity. We also welcome you to our monthly First Friday open house, which visitors can directly experience Mr. Rudolph's spatial genius while walking through a duplex that he designed. The foundation believes that ultimately, architecture is to be experienced in order to understand why it must be preserved. You can learn more about these events and the foundation through our website, paulrudolphheritagefoundation.org. And then finally, I'd like to share a personal story about how I wound up speaking here in front of you tonight. So it was the spring of 1995, and I was presenting my architectural thesis at the University of Cincinnati. And since he was building an addition to our school that year, Peter Eisenman was a member of the jury. My project was a shelter for victims of domestic violence, which was essentially a concrete tower perched on top of a hill with a series of smaller concrete bunkers behind it. After a few questions from the rest of the jury, Peter Eisenman said to me, "Your work reminds me of Paul Rudolph." And never having learned about him in school, I replied, "Who's Paul Rudolph?" Right? My embarrassed professor quickly pulled me aside and said, "He was a great architect, and you should study his work." And then he quickly moved on to the next person. After graduation, I moved to New York, and although I didn't know it, I arrived the year that Paul Rudolph passed away. About 12 years ago, I met Ernst Wagner during an open house at Modulator, where he lives. And since then, I've worked with the foundation to ensure that no one would ever say to me what I said to Peter Eisenman back then. So thank you for coming to our event, and I am very excited to introduce you to a group of people who all know who Paul Rudolph is. I have gotten to know each of them over the years, and believe me, I have peppered them with millions of questions, which they will admit to if you ask them. And I'm sure that at the close of tonight that we will all have a better insight into who was Paul Rudolph. So please welcome our next speaker, Mr. Roberto de Alba, who wrote the book Paul Rudolph, The Late Work, and also owns Split Eye Multimedia, a website dedicated to architects and designers. So please welcome Roberto. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you to the Center for Architecture for hosting this exhibition. And thank you all for joining us in celebrating Paul Rudolph's centennial. I met Rudolph in 1988 after spending about 3 years inside his art and architectural building in New Haven. We were a group of students that we invented this seminar to study the building on our last semester of school there. The seminar led to an investigation of the building, meeting with Mr. Rudolph, and eventually became an exhibition which was just devoted to the building and the design process that Rudolph put the building through, and the university. And the exhibition turned out to be a huge success. Mr. Rudolph came to the opening and said, I feel more welcome here now than I did 20 years ago when the building opened, which we took to heart. And the exhibition triggered the efforts that led to the renovation and expansion of the architecture building at Yale. So it was a very important event at the time. A couple of years later, I started getting curious about what Paul Rudolph was doing after the ANA. No one published him anymore. There were no books available, and we were really all about books. My generation bought books all the time about architects from Europe, from Asia, from the United States. There was nothing on Paul Rudolph. Occasionally, Architectural Record would cover one of his buildings in Southeast Asia, but was very little known. So it occurred to me to propose a book to Mr. Rudolph to try to document the late work. And that's how we had a relationship creating the material for the book. It was surprising to me to find a very long list of projects that we had no idea had been done, designed, some of them built in various cities in Southeast Asia, and some also in the United States. None of them were being published. We knew nothing about it. So I came to him with the idea of working on a book that documented that last period of his life after 1970, when the last book on his work had been published. We went through a long list of projects, selected the highlights to include in the book, and for a couple of years I interviewed Mr. Rudolph on each one of the projects because there was no material, reference material that I could look up. What I discovered was that he had quite a clear memory about each one of the projects and what had happened and about the client and why the project was built or not. And as we migrated through the projects, he would always push me towards these amazing renderings that he had done on one project or another, the famous ink drawings. While he was doing this, I'm pouring through hundreds of sketches in tubes for each one of the projects. And I realized this is the material that I really want to publish. These beautiful sketches that document process on each one of his projects. And that's how the book then took shape. And he was very surprised that I had any interest in any of the drawings. But these are beautiful sketches, very much like the ones in the exhibition here tonight. And color pencil sketches. I had no idea he would use color pencils to document his work or even study a plan or a section. So it was incredibly informative. The book, he never saw it. He passed away in '97. The book was published by Princeton Architectural Press in 2003. But I was able to capture from him every detail that I could about the projects that are documented in the book. About a year ago, I got an email from Nora Leung from Hong Kong. And she says, there is a mistake in your book. So I'm thinking, wow, this errata has been chasing me. It's almost 14 years since the book was published. But she just said, look, the Sino Tower is not the Sino Tower. It's called the Harbor Road Development. Okay. So Sino turned out to have been one of the participants, one of the developers, had a small piece. However, in-house, in the Rudolph studio, it was always referred to as the Sino Tower. So with that in mind, Nora and I continue this conversation about having this show, documenting and showing New York, what Mr. Rudolph, a New York architect, had accomplished in Hong Kong alone. 3 projects that Nora, for which Nora was Rudolph's wingman or wing woman, and saw them through. One of them was built, the Bond Center, and the other 2 are beautifully documented here, and they're also included in the book, the late work. I have nothing else to add except to introduce you all to Nora Leung, principal in her own firm, Chow Koo Leung in Hong Kong, and a collaborator and consultant architect for Paul Rudolph during his years working in Hong Kong. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roberto, for the wonderful introduction. Thank you, everyone, for having me. It is my great honor to be here tonight. I'm Nora Leung. I have been working as architect for 38 years in Hong Kong, of which I had the great fortune of working with Mr. Rudolph from 1984 to 1996, a good 12 years. The first 4 years, I worked as project architect under the employment of a Hong Kong architectural firm, Wong & L Yang Hong Kong Limited. I was the project architect for the construction of the Bond Center. In the next 8 years, as consultant architect with my own practice, Nora Leung Architect, we worked on the design of the Harbour Road project. And with my present firm, which I formed with my husband, Chow Koo and Leung Architects and Engineers Limited, we worked on the Plantation Road project, which is now being shown here. All the contract documents are bound up for your view. In the 1970s and 1980s, it was a time of rapid growth and urbanization in Asia. At that time, Singapore, a post-British colony, and Hong Kong, a British colony at that time, were the most westernized cities in Asia. Many developers were keen to bring in outside Western talents to realize their dream of the city. Paul Rudolph was among the first group of Western architects to come to work in Hong Kong. He was introduced to Hong Kong by a Singaporean developer, the Pontiac Land, for whom he has designed the beautiful residential development, the Colonnade, on Grange Road in Singapore. Other eminent architects who worked in Hong Kong at that period of time include Australian architect Harry Seidler, who designed the Hong Kong Club building in 1981. Sir Norman Foster, Paul Rudolph's student from Yale, designed the Hong Kong Bank headquarters, which was completed in year 1985, at the time when the construction of the Bond Center was still in progress. The well-known I.M. Pei designed the Bank of China building, which was opened in 1990, 2 years after the completion of the Bond Center. However, all these eminent architects designed on land already owned by the users in the established business district of Central of Hong Kong and in economic boom times. For Paul Rudolph, the land he worked on was in the new planning area of Hong Kong, the Admiralty area. The Admiralty area was historically a naval dockyard for the British naval garrison in the 19th century in Hong Kong. This map shows the condition of the coastline about a year after Hong Kong was ceded to Great Britain. As the British established themselves in Hong Kong, the coastline was gradually reclaimed to accommodate the British armed forces. In the late 19th century, this area was a well-developed naval base with military hospital and barracks. The Victoria Barracks, right opposite to the site of Bond Centre, were constructed on the mountains to the south of the harbor. Further uphill was the Victoria Peak, the residential district solely for the British. In the early 20th century, more land were reclaimed for the naval base HMS Tamer. This naval base split up the urban areas of Hong Kong. The central district was not connected with the lower-income residential area of Wan Chai. You see, this is all the naval base. This is the central of Hong Kong, and this is Wan Chai. It was not until the 1970s, due to the gradual retreat of the military in anticipation for the change of sovereignty to China, that the land in Admiralty was returned to the Hong Kong government. Hong Kong government tried to link Central with Wan Chai through the Admiralty area with the construction of the mass transit railway and bus terminus. In 1980s, plots of land in Admiralty were auctioned off, partly to fund the expanding mass transit railway network and to create sources of revenue to the Hong Kong government. Land sale conditions contain specific requirements for each plot of land. In the Bond Centre, sale conditions include the construction of a telephone exchange and a cash transfer office for the mass transit railway. In those days, cash was used in riding trains. The Bond Centre site, was first acquired by a Hong Kong developer in 1981. The site was later relinquished and returned to government of Hong Kong following a crisis of confidence about Hong Kong's future due to the change of sovereignty. Sino-British negotiation began in September 1982. The site was sold for the second time in 1984. This time, it was sold to a consortium of international companies from Singapore, China, Japan, and a Hong Kong company of Singaporean origin. No single Hong Kong developer had the confidence to take up the site. The Singaporean partner brought in Paul Rudolph. He was commissioned to design for the project, which must fulfill the land use conditions and also to adapt to the already built foundation structures. His first sketches show the design of one office tower and one smaller hotel tower based on the built foundation. You can see the hotel here. After many proposals, Rudolph convinced the client to adopt a scheme of 2 office towers of almost the same size to achieve a more balanced architectural composition. This involved additional expenses to reinforce the already built foundations. Column positions were adjusted for the design of 2 office towers, 42 office floors for the West Tower and the 44 office floors for East Tower. Numerous schemes were proposed to explore the relationship between the 2 towers, including joining them with bridges, or linking them with projections on the towers and on the roofs. Both towers were based on octagonal plans with 3 transportational zones, 2 refuge floors to each tower. There are a total of 58 different plans for the 76 office floors. Many proposals were made to improve the top of the building. Unfortunately, All were turned down due to the stringent building control of Hong Kong. This is the major regret Rudolph had for the building. He said after the completion of the project, if I were to design the project again, the podium would be exactly the same. I would, however, give more setback at the top to give the building a stronger silhouette. We had a flat top building eventually. Early elevation study showed one-story projections in the towers, accentuated by wrapping around the edges with a half-round profile. This feature was later only used in the podium. The use of these cantilevered floors was to break down the exterior facade of the tower and to provide an element of human scale to the outside of the building. These projections were referred to as the sky floors, which, when viewed from outside, are exposed on their floors, the roof, and walls, establishing a true human scale in 3 dimensions. In his lecture at Yale on the topic of DNA in architecture, Rudolph described these one-story structures as important humanizing and scale-giving element of 20th century architecture. These are important ingredients in Paul Rudolph's design. In the site of the Bond Center, the neighboring gold curtain wall building, you can see the gold here, representing the gold curtain wall building, the Far East Finance Center, which was newly completed at the time Bond Center was being built, was an important reference point for Rudolph. Although many had adverse opinion of the building, Rudolph thought it is an honest expression of the economic aspiration of the people. The choice of gray reflective glass, controlled use of mass, volume, and scale were his responses to this neighbor. In many angles, the gold building became the background. The relationship of the building with the city is what really matters. In defining the relationship of the whole building to its surroundings, Rudolph weaved the building into the city fabric by progressions of spaces in the podium. There were 4 bridges built together with the building, linking the building all the way from Central across Queensway towards the mountain to the south. The buildings land onto podium terraces with sweeping granite stairs winding and turning around large columns, creating curiosity and spatial progression as one moves from one place to the next. The south facade is the only side where the overall relationship of the tower and podium can be seen. Rudolph called this the superhuman scale. Superhuman scale was adopted to celebrate the power of the building structure. The podium walls and floors are drawn back to reveal the columns and central core structures. The towers are seen to be clearly supported by the columns. With careful massing of the podium spaces, the columns are seen to be of varying heights, adding to the drama of the spatial experiences. 2 wing-like canopies at the south facade define what he calls the symbolic entrance. This is not the entrance to the building. This is the entrance to the urban space formed by the dramatic columns and the fountain. Designed with a grand scale to respond to the mountains and the fast-moving vehicles, the iconic urban space was created for the enjoyment of the city, a rare gesture in Hong Kong. The entrance to the building is from the north, next to the bus terminus, in a much restricted location. Rudolph originally intended to create a green room in the entry courtyard. However, the confined location would be too shady for plants. He therefore chose mirror-finished stainless steel instead of the gray aluminum cladding to reflect and accentuate the outline of the architectural elements. Many proposals were sketched for the canopy over the north entry lobby. This proposal was specially designed for Alan Bond, the new owner in 1987, who bought the shares from the Singaporean partners. Alan Bond had great passion for sailing. His sailboat was the first Australian boat to win the American Cup in year 1983. Shimmering stainless steel tension wires were designed to suspend over the glass enclosure in parabolic curves to form a sail-like structure. This proposal was never built due to maintenance issue. Light is of paramount importance in Rudolph's design. He believes spatial velocity is created by controlled flow of light. In the Bond Center podium, shadows are virtually sculpted on the elevation with the outlines of the beam edges accentuated to give a sense of depth. The accentuation is done by wrapping around the edges with half-round gray aluminum features. Before construction, mock-ups of half-round features were made by using water pipes painted to Pantone colors fixed to the beam edges for Rudolph's selection. 7 different shades of gray were selected, depending on the location of the features and how they catch the light. Rudolph designed spatial qualities through the use of lines. By means of line drawings, he orchestrates the flow of light through the use of light, shadow, surface reflections, textures, patterns, and spatial geometry, until he achieves what he calls the balance between the thrusting and counter-thrusting of spatial forces. He believed that the flow and velocity created in a space arouse human emotions and give the spirit to the space. He sketched all important details in full size by hand. The accuracy of his drawing was stunning. He sketched granite step, granite corner details, cladding panel divisions, elevator cap interiors, and many more. Some of these sketches I have kept for more than 30 years. They are now on show in this exhibition. Unlike the Dharmala building, which he designed in Indonesia before the Bond Center, there were very few cultural references or architectural character that he could draw as regional character from the city of Hong Kong. For the Dharmala, he took inspiration from the traditional Indonesian houses by extending deep eaves and large overhangs with spandrels at 45 degrees. He created contemporary architecture with regional character, blending into the city fabric of Jakarta. In the case of Hong Kong, because of the density of the city and government's stringent control, anonymous concrete boxes and glass-walled buildings are the norm in the city. Rudolph thought the anonymous buildings arise out of functional needs. They form the background and white canvas for the signature and focal buildings which would define special moments that happened in the city. To celebrate I.M. Pei's and Foster's focal building, Rudolph dedicated a viewing platform to the southwest of the podium. This is the viewing, orientated towards these 2 iconic buildings. This is the Foster's building, this is Pei's building. He paid tribute to these 2 architects during many of his trips to Hong Kong. Even after the completion of the Bond Center, Rudolph continued to search for the original character, regional character, and spirit of the city. The ensuing years after completion of the Bond Center were the unsettled times in the city following the Tiananmen Square protests. Rudolph began to read extensively about Chinese architecture. He was particularly interested in Chinese garden design, where progression of spaces and framing of views are important design elements. The Astor Court in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York had his favorite installation of the replica of Wang Xiyuan Garden Pavilion, which he could vividly describe down to the dimensions. He expressed his great interest in visiting the gardens in Suzhou in person, which was finally realized a few years later. Another opportunity came in late 1989 for him to design to add to the Hong Kong skyline. The subject site is very prominent on Harbour Road opposite the Hong Kong Convention and Exhibition Center, which is highly visible from most parts of the city and across the harbor. This is what Roberto called the Sino Tower. It was his very intention to design something to reflect the spirit of the city, which by now he had come to know so well. According to Rudolph, the site lends itself to a focal building. The proposed design grows logically from the site. He wanted to create a memorable silhouette to Hong Kong. He came up with a proposal which was as open as possible at the base, allowing penetration of light and air. An A-frame at the base with ever-decreasing horizontal dimensions as the building goes up vertically. The bulk of the building decreases as it soars into the sky. Hotel floors occupying large floor plates at the base provide more efficiency of use. Decreasing floor plates for offices provide different choices for tenants as the tower grows vertically. The result is a very monumental structure, yet airy and light, resembling the Chinese garden pavilion. Although this project was never realized, it remains one of the most memorable designs he did for the city. The real experience to visit Chinese architecture and garden came in year 1985. Rudolph was invited to lecture in Beijing, Shanghai, and Taiwan. He was fascinated by the ancient construction of the Great Wall, as well as the landscape of his favorite Suzhou garden. Human is whom he designed for. In 1994, a long-term client for whom he had designed a residence in Singapore bought a piece of land on the Victoria Peak of Hong Kong. The peak is always the most prestigious address in Hong Kong. It was solely for the British in the 19th century. Steep topography was the major site constraint. The width of the site measures as narrow as only 150 feet. 3 houses need to be positioned without obstructing each other's view. The East House, the West House were positioned on a lower platform. The South House was raised to maximize the views. In addition, like all family houses, there is the requirement for servants' quarters, which was very difficult to fit in a narrow site. In Hong Kong, it's easy to get servants. We're so spoiled. Steep topography made excavation inevitable. Retaining structures had to be built to support the houses. Each house had its own geotechnical challenges and challenges for the vehicles to access each house as well. You see the driveways are very, very steep. Substantial amount of excavation to form the site, substantial amount of filling and retaining structures to create a buildable platform became heavy financial burden for the project cost. You see, this is the original topography, and he has to fill this amount and cut this amount. The three houses were too costly to build. Rudolph had to think of an alternative. An apartment scheme was proposed with servants' quarters common to all the three duplexes on lower levels. Here he placed all the servants. These servants' quarters were connected to service elevators and communicated with the main apartment through intercom. The apartments would enjoy spectacular views with cantilevered decks in multi directions. There were cantilevered swimming pool to each of the three duplex apartments. A grid of double slender columns were designed to hold up the structures. The juxtaposition of the different elements was quite intricate, and the design intentions were not easy for the Hong Kong government to comprehend when we submit the plans for construction. As a result, building models were made to be submitted to the Hong Kong government together with the plans. The project finally got approval to proceed in year 1996. But then Rudolph's health was deteriorating at that time. On 23rd October 1996, he celebrated his last birthday in Hong Kong. Our topics of discussion never left architecture. He expressed that he would like to see for himself Norman Foster's design of the Hong Kong International Airport, which was planned to open after the handover of sovereignty to China. He visited Norman Foster's Hong Kong office, reading the plans attentively. But he never returned to see the airport built. For as many as 4 times a year over the course of 12 years, from 1984 to 1996, Paul Rudolph had flown into Hong Kong's old Kai Tak airport, marveling each time at the thrills and drama of flying amidst rugged mountains and dense skyscrapers. Can we have the video, please? Can we have the video, please?
Buildings inevitably bring out a sense of pride in people. Buildings need to be related finally to people. In other words, they need to be humanized.
For the city and for the people, his architecture continues to live. Thank you very much. Anyone wants to ask me any questions?
I have a question. Did Rudolph like the airport building by Foster when he visited the office?
He likes the design, but he expressed that, well, he had only one comment. If the world is full of airport of similar design, would one realize where he landed up in? I mean, it has no regional character. It's the regional character that he cares about. He likes Foster's design very much. But a small anecdote, when I was doing my book, Experiencing Bond Center, my editor asked me to ask Paul to write, Mr. Rudolph, to write a foreword for Foster's book, and he did not do it. He thinks he did not have any influence on Foster. but he appreciates Foster's design.
Question. What did you learn from working with Rudolph all those years for yourself?
I cannot be compared with Mr. Rudolph. I respect him, but I totally agree with him. He appreciates the culture of the place when he designs it. And urbanism is very important in his design. So when I have a new project, I think of creating a sense of place in the project, in addition to fulfilling all the functions. The 6 ingredients is always I think about, inevitably.
For those of us who worked on the design development side, it's very interesting to hear about the detailing that you were describing, how he drew details of the risers and the treads of the stair, and any other anecdotes about the selection of materials, the detailing of the elements. It's very interesting.
Thank you. Well, he really wants to choose the correct material under the correct lighting, and as I mentioned, there are 7 different shades of gray to the horizontal half-round features. You won't notice it. I mean, when you visit Bond Center, you thought it's gray is gray. But there are 7 different shades among the different locations, on different locations. It depends where and how they catch light. He was meticulous in choosing material and choosing texture as well. One little feature that I did not mention is because I think I failed him. He liked to create something called the granite waterfall, which was placed between the 2 escalators in the Bond Center. He asked me to make him a sample of split granite. But split granite doesn't exist in Hong Kong. I mean, we don't, at those times, we have to go to Rome, go to Italy to select the granite. And they are being processed in Italy. They are not processed in China as it is now as it is now in current constructions. So we have to ask the workshop to especially do cutting, split, but the splitting was not the way he want. It doesn't expose the granules and the textures as in fair-face concrete. He was envisaging something like the crystals being exposed and catches the light, so it's like shimmering water flowing down between the escalator. But I think I failed him in this detail. It doesn't really work. If you go to Bond Center, you will see it's just granite steps. It's something which cannot be produced in those day and age in Hong Kong.
Nora, question. Preservation. How is preservation in Hong Kong, and what is the status of the building, and is it okay? And I know you and I went there and we saw it, and it's beautiful, and your photographs are amazing, but what is the future of Bond Center and its preservation?
Hong Kong is a very commercial world. If you can buy the whole thing is sold. But fortunately, Bond Center was sold parcel by parcel. So nobody can buy it as a whole. As a result, nobody can buy the whole thing to redevelop it. So it was not landmarked, but I don't think it's going to change. Those people will hang on to the building as long as it continued to be there.
I really appreciate seeing some of the earlier context you showed of this being part of a plan by the Hong Kong government of connecting Admiralty to Central. And the Bond Center does that clearly, but you're also showing a slide of the Bank of China building. And as a pedestrian, the Bank of China building is a wall that cuts, effectively a wall that cuts Hong Kong in two, between Central and Admiralty. So did Pei refuse to participate in that? I mean, they're immediately next to each other. So how did that failure happen?
Actually, the Bank of China building became more accessible with the bridges being connected to Bond Center. Pei, as I said, he's building for the end user. The end user is not the city, it's the bank. Paul Rudolph had the city in mind. He is opening up the city to everyone. He has dedicated an ample amount of space in the podium for the enjoyment of the city. It is a very different design concept. The bank has to be secure. Shirley?
I really appreciate you bringing up things about I guess, I'm not saying the imperfection in the project, but how the idea of the flat top was a non-ideal kind of a solution for a Bond Center. Can you just explain more, how is it a disappointment and what did he actually propose it to be? And leading up to that is the question of the idea of compromise. I guess the idea of, like, you know, Hong Kong being such a hard place to really build anything, to be able to express anything because of all the regulations. And I'm just curious about how did he feel about that process? I mean, was it still fulfilling even though there was a compromise that he had to make?
He feels inevitable. Well, we tried very hard. Actually, there were no height restrictions at that time for the Bond Center, but then everything you build on the roof has to be accountable for what we call the gross floor area. So for commercial reasons, nobody will give up 1 inch of space for the aesthetic of the building. This is the only thing he regrets about the project. And we built the project in a very difficult time economically. So everything, the material is not the most luxurious material. We had granite, but it's the cheapest kind of granite. We have curtain wall, but it's a stick system. It's not the most sophisticated system, but thank God it's waterproof for so many years. We were lucky. It's a budgeted construction. It's not like the Hong Kong Bank. It's not like the Bank of China. Yes. We have another question from... Sino Tower.
If you could just say a few words about its reception, and I know was it part of a competition, or was he the only participant in the development on the architectural side, and how was it received initially, and that sort of thing?
It was a closed competition, and why Rudolph always called it the Sino Tower is because Sino invited him. Sino was one of the partner. in the Bond Center. And the chairman actually likes Bond Center very much. So he was invited to participate in this closed competition. It was a competition among 3 participants. All 3 were not taken. All 3 schemes were not built. Finally, it was a scheme designed by a local architect, which is like a box and with a kind of spire rising up to gain the height. You see it when you come to Hong Kong. It is not. It is a regular Hong Kong building. It was not taken because Hong Kong at that time, well, not at that time, actually now and before, as always, we are very slow in accepting challenges, very slow in accepting something which was not done before. And money is all that matters for developers, unfortunately.
Nora, thank you. I appreciate it. And I have been there, if no one else has been, to see the Bond Center. Nora gave me a personal tour, and it was amazing because she took me to the part where Mr. Rudolph stood and recognized that I.M. and both Norman Foster had done work adjacent when he was working there. And so I appreciate, and it's nice to see all the photographs, and thank you, Nora, for everything tonight. And thank you for this show. So I appreciate it. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. I hope you enjoyed the show. I kept the drawings for the last 30 years.
Yes. So for the last part of tonight, one of the things we wanted to do is, as part of the show, is to talk about, we have 2 events as part of this show. The first one is to deal with people who have, like Nora, had the privilege to work with Mr. Rudolph in either his office or directly with him from overseas. And then the second night next Wednesday, will be people who have worked on his projects since, but may have never met him, but are converting his projects into uses for today. So I would like to invite people up to the stage who have worked for Mr. Rudolph so we could talk about what it was like to work in his office and what he was like as a person. Because this is my favorite part of the evening, where I get to talk to people who knew him, but I never got a chance to meet him. And so I'd like to welcome to the stage again Nora Leung, who worked with Mr. Rudolph, Rocco Leonardis, who also worked in Mr. Rudolph's office, Jeremy Moser, who worked in Mr. Rudolph's office, and Artie Chin, who worked in Mr. Rudolph's office. And this part will be moderated by the guy who wrote the book on Mr. Rudolph. Yes, Roberto de Alba. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. All right. Quick, I guess I have to use this. Quick introductions. Far end, Rocco Leonardis is an architect, teacher, and a long-time collaborator with Mr. Rudolph. He worked on and off in the office for 2 decades on various projects starting in 1969, 68. And next is Ron Chin, who worked for Mr. Rudolph. He's an architect and a Feng Shui Master. And Ron worked for Mr. Rudolph on and off also for many years, and credits Mr. Rudolph with having inspired him and giving him the discipline that he needed to become a Feng Shui Master. Jeremy Moser is an architect practicing in Maine, and he also worked for Mr. Rudolph from 1988 to 1990, and in some of these projects that we covered here tonight. And Nora Leung, you already know. So why don't we start with sharing some recollections of your experiences of working with Mr. Rudolph.
Oh, me. I guess that's me. Well, one figures that if you live long enough, it eventually catches up with you. Forgive me, I'm losing my voice today. Well, working for Paul Rudolph was wonderful because I always liked to draw, and Paul Rudolph liked to draw. And you know, when someone likes to do something, and you're working for someone who likes to do what you like to do, and there's a mutual sense of accomplishment, it's a pleasure. It was a pleasure working for Paul Rudolph. He was a gentleman, always a gentleman, a very creative person, never boring. You know, I've worked for other people at one time or another, and you could just go to sleep. I mean, working for Rudolph, you don't go to sleep. And so, I have some friends here. So you don't go to sleep in Rudolph's office, okay? Everything is always stimulating, and basically you're challenged. As I said, I like to draw, and consequently, that's an understatement, and consequently I found somebody who appreciated it. I found somebody who made use of it. I found somebody who patted me on the back and gave me opportunities to do things. That's a nice world to be in. And as an employee, and as a guy to show up and work on the weekends, you follow me? Yep. It's real stimulation.
You mentioned that you actually shared a desk with Mr. Rudolph at some point.
Yeah, Rudolph would have he has a desk and he's working on something and he wants to draw a part of whatever he's drawing, and then he had me draw something else on it, you know. So things he didn't want to draw. So I had to imitate his style. So a lot of the drawings you see, as you must know, are not done by him directly. They're done by other people, at least back in the days when I worked there. And so they're disguised, if you will, and a pleasure to do so. A pleasure to do so. Stimulate the questions and I'll answer. I mean, it's a long time I worked for the gentleman.
Can Ron share?
Okay. I worked for Rudolph 3 times, and actually that kind of showed the most incredible relationship that I had with him. I started work with him in 1981, and the very first project that was given in Rudolph's office was actually to do a section of the garage of the Dharmala project. And I remember I said, oh my gosh, you know, what am I going to do? So I took the tracing paper, started working on it. And I have to say, I was working on it for at least a couple days, and I really wasn't quite sure what I was supposed to do. And then Rudolph came up to me, and he said, what are you doing? What are they teaching you in architecture school? Architecture is 3 dimensions. And then he pulls out his tracing paper, and he pulls out his color pencils, and he is like drawing an elevation, drawing a section, drawing another, plan, drawing another elevation. And he says, this is what architecture is about. That was my very first experience of working in Rudolph's office. And I have to say, in the very beginning, I was a little bit definitely intimidated. But actually, once you got to know him, he was a very gentle person. And the reason why I worked for him 3 times, interesting that Rocco's saying, he's very stimulating. I worked for him from 1981, 1983. And the reason why I left his office was because it was an incredible studio. It was a very small studio, like 4 or 5 guys, plus Rudolph. But after a while, it seemed kind of the same to me, believe it or not. And I was the budding architect, and I said, I needed to get more experience. So I quit Rudolph in '83 and ended up working at Gachi Papa Christo Smith. And I have to say it was a great firm in terms of learning construction drawings, had a penthouse office overlooking all of Manhattan, but it was like 9 to 5. And I was like so bored, I have to say, in that office. And then Rudolph called me. In '83, he called me up and he said, Ron, I'd like for you to come back to work with me. And I was like, oh my gosh. And I remember talking to the office manager at GPS, and I said, what do I do? And she said, do not go back the same way that you left. So I had lunch with Rudolph, and he said, what did you learn in the last year and a half? I said, well, I finally got licensed in New York State. And he says, well, what can I offer you? And I said, I would love to do a project from the beginning to the end, and I'd love to do an office building. He said, well, I don't know about that, but I can give you a residence. Now, I'll be the designer, but you do everything. And I have to say that really showed his integrity, because that residence I did from soup to nuts. It actually ended up in arbitration, which is very interesting, because that particular home, he basically blew out the back of the house, put in a glass loggia, and there was a leak. And no, there's a couple of leaks there. Anyway, but the bottom line was, during arbitration, I was the one put on the stand because I was the architect. And Rudolph watched me, but he was like a hawk, making sure I documented every single detail along the project. And of course, we won the arbitration because we followed all the rules, we signed all the agreements, and basically the client just kicked the contractor off the job when they were supposed to keep him on to complete all of the work. So, but Rudolph promised what he did. And then after going back with him in the second time, I worked for several years. And then there was a point in my life I said, I was working on the Boston Government Center. And this is when Rudolph was on his trips to Southeast Asia. I was his office manager now. And the Boston Government Center, Rudolph sent all of his sketches by FedEx or DHL, and I transferred all his information into a model, into a presentation, and I got to present to Ed Logue in Boston. Rudolph made a mistake in the calculations. And I said, oh my gosh, I mean, I could change it, but I can't change it. And this is in a time where that was a major dilemma for me. I have the ability to change, but I can't. And so I just made a decision not to change it because I need to respect Mr. Rudolph. And so, of course, Ed Logue was very furious with me or at Rudolph, but all was well after that. But that was the point. I said it was time for me to leave. And it was very difficult for me leaving the second time. And I gave my resignation to Rudolph. He gave it back to me. And he says, what can I offer you? Can I offer you a job in Hong Kong? Can I offer you more money? And I said, no, what I would like to do is to design my own building. And he just looked at me and he says, that's the one thing I cannot offer to you. And we agreed, and he gave me a wonderful sending off at the Russian tea room with the rest of the crew for the second time. It was sad, but at the same time, we knew it was time to move on. Then he called me again. And the reason why he called me again was because the office manager he had at the time, he really didn't like that person. And so he says, name your price. And at that particular time, I was just beginning my Feng Shui work. And so I ended up becoming his office manager again, and from 1990 until when he got sick. And the reason why I left him, actually, when he got sick, I said, I think it's time for me to spread my own wings, and and I'll be there to help the next person. But after all these years, I truly, truly appreciate Rudolph for what I've learned. I've learned to see the world in a whole different perspective. I can manipulate scales, from the bathroom to a city. I mean, it was just so incredible what he gave to me. And to see things in 3 dimensions, and doing Feng Shui, I see things in other dimensions. So anyway, so that kind of shows a little part of my experience working at Rudolph.
Thank you, Ron. Jeremy.
So I worked with Mr. Rudolph for 2.5 years, and I think when we saw the drawings that were up, as the younger architects don't do this as much, he worked in section in a way that I never ever experienced any other architect. He designed from section, and for me, as when I left that office later on, that is how I saw the world, and it made a lot of sense for me rather than working from a plan or so forth or function. A little story, he did not like, Mr. Rudolph would work on a project for years and years, and the paper would lose its tooth. And anybody that ever worked on vellum before knows there's a product you use, and you can sand it up and you can keep drawing. But his papers were as thin as glass. And the trick was always how to keep up with all the revisions that he would make over the years and still not replace the drawing. Or if you did replace a drawing, you had to do it in such a way that it looked like the original drawing. And he wasn't the best draftsman. I think some of that wasn't what he did. So it was a very, very chaotic and a wonderful time, I think. Every day I would go into the office to manage a model, or a project manager when I was in Mr. Rudolph's office was a person that had worked on the project the longest, which might have been 2 months, 3 months, 1 week. And then Mr. Rudolph would pull that person off to work on another project, and the next person who wasn't doing anything at the time would end up picking up the piece and trying to gain all the information. I think I was there for 2.5 years. I think we worked on 19 major projects in terms of design development. And again, anybody that's worked in offices, that's a lot of, he had to be able to control so many ideas and so many different kinds of programs. So it was overwhelming, and in 2.5 years, I was pretty much burned out. And I needed a break for a little bit, but you never had a game plan. Every day you went in, and if he saw you had a plan, he would change it for you. Or he would, sometimes there was a column, and if you called it a column, he would say, no, it's a post. And he was always trying to keep us off center in a way so that we were more open to the process. I don't know. I think that's all. Ron actually described a lot of the things.
Rudolph loved to work in 3D. So models was like clay. So foam core, balsa wood, and we would do a model. That is not the be-all, end-all. It's like, okay, let's change it. Let's change it again. Let's change it again, and then do drawings to go with it. And of course, the color pencils, for me, which I now use in my design process, is all about, blue was for windows, for water. Green is for plants. Red is for the major structures. I use colors just to kind of give the background. So it was interesting to see Nora showed the slides of, you know, the gold building, and that was his sketch, was showing the gold building. So that was his way of defining all the various layers of the architecture that he was sculpting space. He was a master of sculpting space.
So then 2 more, and then I'm out of here, so to speak. I finished, the Engel Residence was a project that Mr. Rudolph had been working on for 3.5, 4 years. By the time I came on, and I was the 3rd architect, the workmen weren't nailing boards in place. They weren't putting in baseboards. They were very leery of even finishing off the drywall because Mr. Rudolph was constantly changing the design. He would see something, he would try to make it better. So luckily, I suppose, he'd come to a conclusion, or he had other larger projects, and he stopped revising. And in the same line, when we were making models, or I was running a model and there's a deadline, we have a very few weeks to build fairly sophisticated models out of basswood or whatever, he would constantly change the model. And it turned me into more of a technique person versus drawing as much. But we would always try to hide things from him so that we would be able to get the models out to the client, to the developer, without it being in pieces. And so it was an interesting time. It was fun, but you know.
I should speak.
Yeah.
Please do, Rocco.
My experience in working for Paul Rudolph is very different than yours. Extremely different. I started working for him in 1969. The office then was big, lots of people, tons of people. Rudolph never gave me any bunk. Okay, he would like come over to my desk and look at me and say, "Rocco, today you're going to do a perspective." Now, I, of course, was hoping that that day I may just have to work on the detail I was doing the other day. But now I knew I was in for it for at least 3 to 4 weeks. So that was good. But he just, you know, he would just have me do it. And he'd look at it, he'd have me make some sketches, and then he'd pick what he wanted, and we'd proceed. Never gave me any bunk, and never hid anything from him. And I built a lot of models for him, and of course we wanted him to. I enjoyed the changes because, oh yeah, they made you crazy. I had to keep doing them, of course. But I enjoyed them because they always produced something more, another aspect. That's what I was there for. If I just wanted to work for some dumbass architect, pardon my French, I mean, I could do that, okay? But the idea is I was getting something out of this, you know? So very different. So I started in 1969. I quit. I went back to work again. He hired me for another, what was it? Rick would remember, so like a lot of years. I mean, yeah, I found it very nutritious for this. It was very good for me. And built a lot of models for him too. And made a lot of changes. Yeah, a lot of changes. So please.
I wanted to ask Jeremy about something you mentioned about him being invited to take a look at the Guggenheim edition before.
I think it was in 89, 88. Price, he said he had a request. Oh, mind this. He had a request to, I believe he was one of the first people asked to consider redesigning or doing the administrative wing for the Guggenheim. And it's very straightforward. We had somebody from, I can't remember the name of the person, from Frank Lloyd Wright's office in New York, came and visited us at 50.
Edgar Taffel.
I guess so.
Yeah.
Very gentle soul. And he talked to us about the process of making. And then about a week and a half later, Price and I went down to start measuring the entry sequence in the Guggenheim. And it was very interesting because we discovered that there was no storage space. There was less than 1,000 square feet of storage space for artworks at the Guggenheim. It was just basically slab on grade. So he started sketching some ideas, and I believe there was a change in the, they basically fired the entire board and restructured the whole project. So eventually, I think it was Guanthe Siegel did the addition. So we never saw sketches of elevations, but we did start with it, and we were very excited at the time that we'd have an opportunity to work in that space. So,
wow.
I mean, yeah.
Jeremy,
Yeah.
maybe you should tell Nora the story about the base of the Sino Tower.
Who was the architect? Was it George Renault? Who was the architect that came in? Well,
George.
Okay, so we had a lovely relationship, and it was fun to work so intensively and just do the projects. But the 10 hours before we were supposed to ship the model to Hong Kong, Mr. Rudolph came in, looked at the model, and this model took 7 architects, 6 weeks. So again, I'm talking process. But it was a very beautiful, it was made of basswood. You know, we had custom, I mean, we made...
5 feet high?
Yes, it was very large and beautifully detailed. So he came in with George Rinaldi?
George Rinaldi.
And he said, George and he were talking, and they decided they just broke the bottom piece out, which was you just pulled it off, and they just threw it away, and started talking about how they could make it better, maybe it should be narrow or whatever. And then they took the top off of the building. There are the water towers, and you know, it's just, I guess I'm trying to talk a little bit of humor. It was a great deal of fun working there, but we're trying to make his deadline, which he wants us to have, and so we're very quiet and very respectful, and all night long, we revised the model and got it out. And maybe those changes were better. but he was constantly questioning himself. But it reminded me that when we did a place called Institution Hill, and I made maybe 5, or there were 7 models, I believe. We did 5 when I was there. There was 1 more after I left, and I don't think the building was ever realized. But I was drawing plans for Institution Hill. I was doing a 2- and 3-bedroom on slab, let us say, on 1 level. And Mr. Rudolph gave me this very, very messy sketch, and we've been working there long enough to kind of interpret it. I got it right. He blessed the design, and I thought I was very, very bright. You know, I've got this. So when the Yale Architecture exhibition came along, I was down on the third floor, and I had all the flat files. There was a little model-making shop there and drafting. And we were pulling drawings out, and this sketch fell out on the floor that was an 8.5 by 11. It was a plan, it had a date on it. It was 7 years before I did my drawing, and it was exactly the drawing that I thought I had created. And so what I realized, though, is he took a lot of time, and he had great clients, great developers that would allow him 7 years to work on these projects and develop them. And so he was very fortunate in that, and he worked very hard. But he'd already thought of everything we came up with, what we thought we were coming up with as younger architects, I suppose, designers. So, good.
I have a question for Nora. So how was it to work with Mr. Rudolph from so far away? I assume you guys communicated through fax or whatever was available at the time. And how did that influence the design process? And were there any interesting snafus along the way?
We actually gone through snail mail, fax, and finally mobile phone. You know, those big phone, Motorola phones. He never used it. I have one, but I offered to give him one. He never used it. At the snail mail age, I waited and waited and waited. No mail came. Jeremy just told me that I am a name. He knew me just by name because I'm the name of the address that he used to ship to. But, you know, the project has to go on. So there's a time difference of 12 hours. I used telephone. I described things to him in detail, how I'm going to use it. But during the time that he is in Hong Kong, we must use the time very wisely. So a lot of mock-ups were built, you know, out of scratch, out of water pipes, plywood, whatever. We will make something 3-dimensional for him to see. So he practically worked from morning 10 o'clock to nighttime 8 o'clock, straight on, without, well, we bring in sandwiches for him, very intensively during the days that he is in Hong Kong. It is a real experience. I guess my capacity of working with him is very different from you guys. I'm like a satellite, you know. I'm not around him all the time, and he cannot step on me. But he is very, very gentle, very, very courteous to me. The thing is, you have to understand his design principles. From day one, I was selected to work for him. He explained to me very clearly the DNA of architecture. He showed me the movement diagram, the spatial diagram that he analyzed, how he analyzed the Wright building, how he analyzed the Kabul building. He gave me a lecture before we started. And I kind of understand, and he kind of got that I understand, and he said, you can work for me. And from then on, every time I work with him, I have to make sure that all his design principles are fulfilled. it's great challenge to make it, to realize his design, because in those days, it's not as easy to engineer something special, especially in Hong Kong. People are used to concrete, they are used to building concrete boxes, they are used to build in straight lines. So we have to spend a lot of time explaining the design to structural engineer, to building services engineer. And in those days, without computer, it's even more difficult with the different floor plans. Actually, at the time that Bond Center was designed, there was no computer. Everything was done by hand. But finally, we found very difficult in positioning the sprinkler heads in the center of the ceiling panels. So I asked my boss for extra budget to have the plans, to have at least the floor plans done in computer, so I can plot the sprinkler heads and lay out the ceiling grids. So that was the challenges at that time. Gradually, as we move along, we did the Plantation Road finally in computer drawings for the submission. So that was in 1996.
Well, I have to say, I don't think Rudolph would probably like working in our offices today. I mean, he hated computers. And I mean, he was the sculptor. He really needed to be hands-on, to have the trace paper, to have the model, to really manipulate it. I don't think these, these CAD drawings or these 3D, he would not be happy. He would not be happy.
He is actually very interested in knowing the computer. But one thing about the computer is that people zoom in and zoom out. It's very difficult to grasp the scale, and scale is the one thing that he cares about. So, well, computer is the tool, but in your head, you got to know how big a chair is, how tall a person is in order to draw. I mean, you have to know your scale. For computer drawings, sometimes people lose track of the scale, and that is what he feared about.
I mean, I have to say he was a master of scale. He would take the 2.6 meters. Okay, now this is 3 inches right now, and so you have to manipulate in your mind, which system that you're using in terms of which project that we're working on. But he was a master of scale, and he's always marking off exactly the inches, the meters, and wherever things needed to be. And the one thing that I learned from Rudolph was you have to label every single sketch as to what time you did it, because all of a sudden it's another concept. Okay, there's another concept, there's another concept. So you have layers of trace paper. Okay, which was the last concept, but then he might pull it off again. So, that was also a challenge, but also it was an incredible experience, to be working, with such a master.
Yes, sorry, Jeremy.
I was thinking if everybody has the opportunity to go see any of his projects here. 23 Beekman is not accessible right now, yet, but there's an example if you got a chance to see it, the way that he manipulated scale, section, perspective. He would have 5'8" high edges that you would have to walk under to go to a triple height space. I think the modulator building, it's very narrow, but again, if you get an opportunity to go there, you'll get a sense of how he scaled very thin pieces, very heavy pieces, and it's a great opportunity to see how he designed relentlessly.
Yeah. You mentioned 23 Beekman. I worked on all of the 23 Beekman projects and carried the keys in my pocket for a good many, many years. Yes, no railings on the stairs. I've been to parties there and no one ever fell off. Okay, it's just a fine use of scale. Now, I don't know if it's accessible. I used to give tours of it years ago. Yes, the modulator building does show some of that, but of course that was not built for him. The 23 Beekman is the one that one should look at because that was made for him himself. You know, you walked in and you looked up and you're looking through the bottom of a plexiglass jacuzzi and the skylight is above it. Nice.
I mean, 23 Beekman was his laboratory, his personal architectural laboratory. And I have to say, it was incredible to be working there. And just going back to what Nora was saying, he was an incredible teacher. He made sure that we, as his crew, understood his design principles so then we can start doing whatever drawings that we needed to do. So then we all had a very clear understanding about what he was thinking. I remember him sitting there in the office showing how he was doing the design for the Yale Art and Architecture building. And even though it was already done, he was actually preparing for another exhibition there, but it was showing how the chi, or the energy, or the flow of what was going on. And so, and how he wanted to have a flow in all of his buildings. That's why all his buildings seem to have like steps to it. It's really not steps, he's actually making it a spiral. That is, in a way, that was his, his main, design concept was the spiral, and how he can work with the spiral, but at the same time, how do you marry it with heaven, humanity, and earth? And so that's what the Bond Center was all about. How do you see yourself within that entire building, yet you can see that whole building, yet you know where you are within that building? And so it was, it was incredible just to watch him, play with people and play with scale and play with space. It was an incredible experience. And just going back with what Rocco was saying, it was great to actually sit next to Rudolph. He was very personal. We all get to sit or be right next to him working on a project. He didn't like, okay, yes, he'll hand it off, you go sit in your own little corner, but he is right there on top of you, or he's sitting right next to you working on the project. And so that was really a great experience.
And on the weekends, too.
On the weekends.
I'd like to ask a question, and that's for all of you, including Roberto. Could you tell me a story about your very first meeting with Mr. Rudolph? What was that like? Some of you, I think, have got some good stories, and maybe some of you were kind of like, whoa. But what was your first experience meeting Mr. Rudolph? And I'd like to start with Roberto, because I know that you met him kind of later on. Well, you can tell us.
I met Mr. Rudolph with a bunch of my classmates as we had decided to explore the Art and Architecture building, to go see the guy who had designed it and get a sense of how we were going to go about this. And I clearly remember, and I photographed a lot that day, so there is actual records of that meeting. We met him at his house in Beekman Place, and he sat on the floor. We sat around him like camp, and he asked us a question. He said, "Who do you want to speak to, the architect or the teacher?" That was the first question he asked, and I think we all agreed that we wanted to hear the architect because we were interested in the process that he had taken this so famous building through. And so that was my experience, meeting him for the first time.
My very first experience of meeting with Rudolph was I was looking for a job in New York City, and I bumped into one of my colleagues from Penn, and she suggested me to go to the New York State Unemployment Agency to look for a job. I said, okay, brought my portfolio there, and it's a big open office, and I met Mrs. Walter, who had her little 3x5 cards, looked at my portfolio, flipped through the 3x5 cards, turned around and says, "How about Paul Rudolph? Would you be interested?" And I was like, Paul Rudolph? And this is in 1981, and in my mind, I was like, I thought he was already gone. I mean, Anyway, so I had an interview at his office, and the first interview was actually with Donald Luckenbill, who was the office manager. So I met with Donald first, and Donald set me up, and I saw Rudolph the following week. And Mr. Rudolph, that was when I first met him, was for my interview. And so he was very relaxed. He didn't really wear a tie. and just sat in his office, and this is his office on West 57th Street, and which was, you know, a big open studio. And he says, why would you like to work with me? And I said, well, you know, I want to do some design work, and I don't have to admit, I don't remember what I said. And after we chatted for probably not more than 15 to 20 minutes, he says, when can you start? I was like, anytime. And he says, well, you know, start tomorrow. And at that time, I was living in Philadelphia. So I commuted from Philadelphia to Manhattan for an entire month so that I could work with Rudolph. And within that month, I was able to find my apartment in Midtown Manhattan. But for me, that was my very first experience of meeting Rudolph.
Once again, my experience is very different. Okay. I was a student at Pratt Institute. I had my own class to teach. In those days, they allowed students to teach a design class. And I taught it for a bit, and then, you know, I always find that having ethics is very expensive, so I quit because I disagreed with the director. So suddenly I just quit a job again because I disagreed with the director. So I found myself without a job, you know, and so I asked the secretary at school, Enid Eastwood, and Enid said, well, why don't you go over to 54 West 57th Street? They might be hiring. I said, okay. So I didn't know, I didn't know that Paul Rudolph was a famous man. I just went over to 54 West 57th Street. It's 1969. I walk in the door. There's all these people. There must have been 6 secretaries. I mean, it was really a big operation. And, you know, I gave him my name, stand over there. This is a student, right? You know, I stand over there. My secretary's on the phone. She says, you, go to the 5th floor. You're to work with Mr. Rudolph. So I went to the 5th floor. I look around. You know a guy named Rudolph? Is there a guy named Rudolph on this floor? Okay, you understand. These people were really wired. So I hunted around the floor for a while and then found that there was a back room. Yeah, the back room. Ralph Brescia was working in the back room, Airy, a few other guys. They were not wearing 3-piece suits. The guys in the back room were nice. They said, oh yeah, Rudolph works here. Oh, that's his desk over there. Just, you know, be back. So Rudolph comes in. I look at him, he looks at me. He takes a piece of paper out of his pocket. He says, draw that up. So I drew it up. And he checked it, said, good. He says, you can work for me. And that's how I met Mr. Rudolph. And I learned that there's a front room and a back room.
I learned about Mr. Rudolph through my partner in the design studio at Columbia, who was named Daniel Wang. So I saw a photograph of him up. That was great. Daniel told me to call the office. I think I called 5 or 6 times, and the office administrator, wasn't you at the time, I can't remember her name, but I would never get an in. I finally found Ron. Ron said, after interviewing me, we'll hire you, but when Mr. Rudolph comes back from China, he may fire you immediately. So I worked on Institution Hill, I think, for 6 weeks, waiting for the day when Mr. Rudolph would return. And there was a conference room. He took me into the back room. He looked at the work, and he said, only 10% of the architects I know can think in 3 dimensions. The rest can't, and they're not worth their weight in salt. He said, I believe you can think in 3 dimensions, so you can stay for now. And it was always on that edge. And that's how it worked, I guess. And we tried, you know, to be good listeners, and it was very much fun.
I have to say, there was many guys, or I don't think there hardly any women actually worked in the office, which was kind of interesting. Yeah, you really had to learn to understand what he was looking for, or to make sure you were able to find the solutions for what he was looking for. And even though he may not like the solution, at least you looked for the solutions to help him. And so that was the one thing that I did learn, is to make sure that you have an answer for him. And you better make sure you find some kind of an answer. And it can't be just like, I don't know. That would not be good. So, it was great.
Nora, first encounter.
Well, I was not the first project architect to work on the Bond Center project. The first project architect Rudolph did not have a very good relationship with. So I guess he asked the boss to send someone suitable. I was then just 2 years after I get qualified. I was always the girl who peeped inside the design room and see what is happening with the design of the Bond Center. I was intrigued. Actually, I was intrigued by the drawings that were produced in the design room. We had a big design room, especially for visiting architects. I was intrigued by what was produced inside that room, so I was always hanging around in the entrance, and I saw Rudolph coming in and out, and I said, "Good morning, Mr. Rudolph," and he said, "Good morning" back to me. And that was it for a year or so. And then suddenly one day, my boss called me and said, "Stop what you're doing, come in to the design room." And I went into the design room, and there he was, and he said, hello, I know you. You're working for me." And that was it.
Any questions?
There's just a detail about Paul Rudolph and his perception of 3 dimensions that I've concluded where he got that talent. As many of you people in the panel probably know, he was an accomplished musician, and he's quite a good pianist, as a matter of fact, trained that way before he became an architect. And I remember walking into his apartment in New Haven. You entered on the 2nd floor, and you walked down these steps, no railing. There were cantilevered steps with no riser and no handrail. Everything was white, except in the middle of the room was a black grand piano. And on the piano was a folder, a yellow folder, with the words Bach. Now, if you talk to any jazz musician or classical pianist, you will learn from them that that's a 3-dimensional experience. And I think that's something that maybe people should know about Rudolph.
Thank you.
I just want to just also share that Rudolph had incredible passion, incredible energy. I mean, as one who does Feng Shui or Chinese energy, I mean, I was like maybe 30 years his junior or senior, whatever it is. I mean, he put me under the table with the amount of energy that he was drawing and composing, talk about composing or, changing. It was absolutely an incredible time. And, well, I feel very honored and privileged, to have that and to continue my life on my ongoing journey.
It was also not easy doing those trips. It took 16 hours for me to fly from Hong Kong to here, to New York. At those days, it was 24 hours, and he has to stop by Japan, or sometimes he flew via San Francisco. He stayed for a day, and then 12 hours to Hong Kong. I remembered when he was doing the presentation for the Harbor Road project, he practically just arrived the airport, slept for a night, and then the next day, 9 o'clock, he has to do the presentation. And he told me, "I was very, very tired, Nora. I have to lie down." and I find a couch for him to lie down, and he said, "You have to wake me up." So I'm very nervous. I pop in and out of the door and see when is the meeting going on. So I asked somebody to alert me, and I wake him up, and the second he woke up, he is all alert. He was standing up and just do his presentation like normal. It's not easy. Right now, I'm having a poor jet lag myself, so I know it is not easy doing those long distance travels and work right away. He usually just stay for a week and then leave Hong Kong and come back in 2 weeks' time or 2 months' time. I never know because he had other commitments, and I just have to chase him, follow up with phone calls. Send him letters. Yeah, it is not easy coping with the time difference and coping with the travels.
Well, thank you, everybody. I appreciate. Is there any more questions?
Question.
One more question.
One question for Nora. As we know, Mr. Rudolph didn't have that many women working for him. Can you speak a little bit about?
Nora, if you wouldn't mind just commenting additionally on what it was like as a woman to be working for Mr. Rudolph. Do you feel that you were treated any differently or not at all? If you could just perhaps comment a little bit about this, because it was so unusual given what else we've heard from the other gentleman on the podium.
I just mentioned I was not the first architect doing the Bond Center project. The first one was a male architect. And I don't think it makes a difference being a woman or a man working for him, as long as you understand what his design principles are, as long as you understand what he's looking for in the design. He will make sure you understand what he tries to design, what his design intentions are. And he will let you do it. I mean, I did some of the details in the Bond Center. He really had no time to do it, and I do it for him. And I have to follow up with a lot of explanations, and he accepted those which he thinks would fulfill the design principles that he had. He is not a person who do not accept other people's ideas. There are ideas that I made, which I was thrilled that he actually accepted what I proposed and actually got built. That is what inspired me to start my own practice. I started my own practice right after I finished Bond Center. I think I had such a good experience that I quitted my job, and I wrote a book, which is a very small book. It's out of print now. I wrote a book, and I want to start on my own. I have designed my ideas of my own, and I had no idea who's going to hire me, but I had a mobile phone at that time, and somebody called me one day and said, "Hey, Nora, are you the one who helped Mr. Rudolph?" I said, "Yes." And so I had the first job. It was one of the alteration jobs in Bond Center, and then I started my own practice, and then other commissions come in. Well, of course, I stated that I'm not Paul Rudolph. I had my own design ideas, but I totally appreciate what he taught me. And I think he respected being an outsider to Hong Kong. He respected the culture, the history of our people, and he received everything in open mind. He is not a stubborn person. As soon as he understands what you're talking about, he thinks it's right, he would accept it. It makes no difference you're a woman or a man.
Great, great. Thank you.